May 24th, 1998, 7:50 a.m., Mount Everest, 28,000 feet above sea level. She can't move. Her legs fold. Her hands are frozen stiff. Her eyes are wide open, staring at nothing. And all she can whisper over and over is, "Don't leave me. I am an American. Why are you doing this to me?" Climbers are right there. She can see them, hear them. They're looking at her, at each other, and then they're walking away. She watches them go. Days before this heartbreaking moment, one word sealed her fate. This climber is already dead, and she knows it. Welcome to the extreme edge. Francys Arsentiev and her husband Sergey made a decision months before they ever set foot on Everest in 1998. They would climb the mountain without supplemental oxygen together, as true equal partners. Francys would become the first American woman to summit Everest without bottled oxygen, and Sergey would guide her there. That was the dream. On paper, this was a solid plan. Sergey Arsentiev, the husband, was one of the best Soviet mountain climbers of the 20th century. Before becoming a climber, he was an electrical engineer who designed satellite stabilization systems for Russian intelligence. This was literally a rocket scientist turned mountaineer. His achievements said it all. He was one of the few climbers alive to own the Snow Leopard title, an award given for summiting all 5 Soviet 25,000-foot peaks. He climbed Annapurna's north face in alpine style without oxygen in 1991. He had even climbed Everest before without oxygen in 1990 on a joint US, Chinese, Russian peace climb. So this was not a big ask. Francys herself was capable. She was one of the few women at the time to have summited Mount Denali, the tallest mountain in North America, successfully. She was the first American woman to ski down Elbrus. But here's one thing to note. Although she had climbed to 24,600 feet on Soviet-era Pamir peaks, she had never summited a 26,000-foot mountain successfully. Everest would be her first attempt above 26,000 feet, a margin of over 2,000 feet. That's not just a gap, that's an entirely different physiological universe. But they trusted the plan, and in the spring of 1998, Francys and Sergey arrived at Everest Base Camp with only one thought in their mind: to make history. Their climbing route was straightforward. They planned to attack Everest from the north side via the northeast ridge with a Russian expedition team made up of 5 members. Like other climbers at base camp that season, they took their sweet time getting prepared, because you can't just show up at the base of Everest and climb straight to the top. Your body would shut down and you'd die. So, climbers spend weeks going up and down the mountain in stages, letting their bodies slowly adapt to the thin air. This process is called acclimatization, and it involves gradually climbing up the mountain and resting in certain camp spots while your body gradually learns to function with less oxygen. It's slow, it's deliberate, and it's the only way to survive up there. On May 19th, Francys and Sergey reached Camp 6 at around 26,000 feet. They were now in what climbers call the death zone, where there isn't enough oxygen in the air to sustain human life for extended periods. Your body starts dying. Every hour you spend here means your muscles break down, your organs struggle, and your brain slowly starves. But it was all going according to plan. From Camp 6, they would make their final push to the summit. Their first summit attempt came the very next day, on May 20th, and it was here that things started going wrong. The plan was to leave Camp 6 at 1 a.m. in complete darkness, using headlamps to light the way. Starting in the middle of the night meant you'd reach the summit around midday when it's warmest, and you'd have plenty of daylight to get back down safely. Timing is everything on Everest. But when Francys and Sergey woke up at 1 a.m. to start climbing, their headlamp batteries were dead. The extreme cold at 26,900 feet had killed them. Without headlamps, they couldn't safely navigate the technical mountain grounds of Everest in darkness, so they had to wait until the sun came up at 6:30 a.m. By the time they finally started climbing, they'd already lost 5.5 hours. They were moving slower than planned without supplemental oxygen, and when they reached a technical rock section called the first step, at around 27,900 feet, they realized the math didn't work anymore. It was too late in the day. If they kept going, they'd be descending in darkness. So they turned around. So they came back down to Camp 6. That's 2 nights now in the death zone. When Sergey reached the tents, he went over to the tent of a fellow climber and team member at base camp named Anatoly Moshnikov and explained what had happened. Anatoly listened, then he did something that revealed just how concerned he was. He gave Sergey a spare battery and he offered to climb with them on their next attempt. But Sergey said, thanks, but no, they'd be fine. They'd try again tomorrow. And on May 21st, they tried again. But this time, their bodies were already showing the toll of climbing Everest without extra oxygen. They barely made it 300 feet from Camp 6 before they had to stop. Their legs felt heavy. Their breathing was labored even at rest. The cumulative effect of spending 2 nights above 26,000 feet was catching up to them. So they retreated back to Camp 6 again. Another failed attempt. That's now 3 nights in the death zone. Meanwhile, that same day, Anatoly, his friend, summited Everest successfully. And at around 6 p.m. on May 21st, he was already back to Camp 6 from the summit. Sergey congratulated him on his success and complained about their failed attempt. Anatoly looked at Sergey. He knew this man had conquered Everest before and had what it took to survive up there, but he also knew what spending 3 nights in the death zone does to the human body. He'd just summited himself that same day and knew exactly what condition you needed to be in to survive up there. And Francys and Sergey weren't in that condition anymore. So he told Sergey, come down with me. Don't try again. You've been up here too long. Your bodies are breaking down. Every hour you stay, you get weaker, not stronger. And Sergey said no again. He thanked Anatoly for the concern, but he said they were fine. They'd rest 1 more day, let their bodies recover, and then they'd make one final push. Now, before you think this was pure recklessness or arrogance, understand what Sergey was calculating in his head. He'd done things on mountains that most climbers couldn't even attempt. His wife was competent. They had almost reached the summit before time forced them back. More importantly, they had invested everything they had into this moment, both physically and financially. They'd refinanced their house to fund this expedition, spend weeks going up and down the mountain, acclimatizing their bodies to the cold, the thin air. And Francys was so close to achieving her dream of becoming the first American woman to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. Why quit now? Psychologists call this the sunk cost fallacy. The more you've invested in something, the harder it becomes to walk away. Even when walking away is the smart choice, your brain says, we've come too far to quit now. We've sacrificed too much. It's not stupidity, it's just human nature. So Anatoly descended while Francys and Sergey stayed. And 8 hours later, at 2 a.m. on May 22nd, they left Camp 6 for their 3rd and final attempt. And this time, no matter what, they weren't turning back. But right from the start, they were in trouble. Their pace was dangerously slow. They had now spent 4 nights in the death zone, and it had taken its toll. Every step felt like wading through concrete. Their legs burned with a deep, exhausting ache that wouldn't go away, no matter how long they rested. Down at base camp, Anatoly Shabanov, a leader of a separate expedition, was tracking multiple climbing teams throughout a powerful 60x telescope. At 10 a.m., around 8 hours after Francys and Sergey had started climbing, Shabanov spotted them at the first step at around 27,900 feet. Even from 10,000 feet below, through the telescope, he could see how slowly they were moving. By 2 p.m., 4 hours after being spotted, they'd only climbed to the second step at 28,250 feet. They had covered 750 feet in 4 hours. That's less than 200 feet per hour. At that pace, they were barely moving. This was problematic because 2 p.m. is a critical time on Everest. The sun sets at around 6 p.m. If you're not at or near the summit by 2 p.m., you're going to be descending in darkness. And descending in darkness at 28,000 feet, exhausted, is a death sentence. But Francys and Sergey were still 800 feet below the summit. They'd need at least another 4 hours to cover that distance at their current pace. So they had a decision to make. Turn around now and survive, or keep climbing toward the dream that had consumed them both, knowing that every minute past 2 p.m. meant less daylight for the descent, less margin for error, less chance of making it back alive. They kept climbing. At 5:45 p.m., Rustam Rangapov, another climber from an expedition that successfully summited earlier that day, was descending when he encountered Francys and Sergey on the gentle slope about 300 feet below the summit. Rustam was exhausted. He'd been climbing since before dawn, and all he wanted now was to get to safety before his own body gave out. But when he saw Francys and Sergey, what he saw made him stop. Francys was, according to his reports, moving with agonizing slowness. She was sitting down frequently and struggling with every step. It was extremely clear to Rustam that this summit attempt was taking everything she had to give. At that point, the sun was already low on the horizon, the temperature was dropping fast, and they still hadn't even reached the summit. Despite his exhaustion, despite his desperate desire to descend to safety, Rustam felt he had to do something. So he turned around and walked 150 feet back up the mountain in the fading light just to try to convince them to turn around. "It's too late," he told them. "Look at the sun. You're moving too slow. You need to turn around right now while you still have light to see the route down." But Sergey shook his head, and for the third time on this summit attempt, said one heartbreaking word that would seal her fate. "No. Don't worry about us. We'll be fine," he said. Radgapov looked at Francys again, struggling. She didn't look fine, but what else could he do? He couldn't force them, and he had his own survival to consider. So Radgapov turned around and continued his descent, and Francys and Sergey kept climbing toward the summit as the sun sank lower and the temperature dropped and the shadows grew longer. Somehow in the next 30 minutes, they pushed through. They found something, a final reserve of determination and desperation that fueled them as they covered that final few hundred feet. And at approximately 6:15 p.m., in rapidly fading light without supplemental oxygen, after 5 days above 27,000 feet, Francys and Sergey reached the summit of Mount Everest. They had done it. Francys Arsentiev became the first American woman to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. It was honestly a historic, monumental achievement, one for the history books. But there were no photos of celebration, no whoops of victory, just two exhausted people standing on top of the world in the dying light, already knowing at some level they're in trouble. And here's why. From the summit at 29,029 feet down to Camp 6 at 26,900 feet is over 2,000 vertical feet of descent. In good conditions with fresh legs, that takes a minimum of 4 to 5 hours. But Francys and Sergey didn't have good conditions or fresh legs. They'd been climbing for over 16 hours. They'd spent 5 nights in the death zone, and the sun was already setting. They had maybe 15 to 20 minutes of usable twilight left before complete darkness, which meant they were going to be climbing down the tallest mountain in the world for at least 4 hours in pitch black, freezing temperatures and without oxygen. Sergey knew this was a death wish. He had to know this. But he also believed they had a safety net. See, here's what I didn't mention. When Sergey saw Rustam and told him not to worry, it was because he had a backup plan. Before the summit bid, He and Francys had stashed an emergency cache at 28,280 feet, about 750 feet below the summit. In that cache, they had stored an oxygen bottle, a tent, and warm clothing. The idea was, if they summited late and couldn't make it all the way down to Camp 6 in darkness, they could descend to the cache, set up the tent, use the oxygen, and wait out the night in shelter. Then, in the morning, with daylight and fresh oxygen, they'd descend the remaining 1,400 feet to Camp 6. Now, it wasn't ideal. Spending a night at 28,280 feet, even in a tent, would be brutal. But it was survivable. The tent would protect them from the wind, the oxygen would help them think clearly, and in the morning, they'd be able to see the route. What Sergey didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Rodgapov had already passed by their cache on his way down. And when Rodgapov checked it, he saw the oxygen bottle was there, but the tent they were counting on to shelter them through the night at 28,280 feet wasn't there. In fact, it was 3,000 feet lower at 25,260 feet. It had never been at the cache. So why did Sergey think it was there? Now here's where we have to be very careful, because what I'm about to tell you isn't confirmed eyewitness testimony, but what mountaineering experts have reconstructed from the evidence. And the evidence tells a very specific story. These are the facts. Sergey told Rodgapov they had a tent at the cache. When Rodgapov checked the cache, there was no tent. And because Francys and Sergey were climbing without Sherpa support, they were solely responsible for moving their own gear up the mountain. Nobody else could have put that tent in the cache, only them. From those facts, the logical conclusion is that Francys and Sergey simply failed to get their emergency tent high enough. But why? There are two leading theories. The first is physical exhaustion. After 4 nights in the death zone without supplemental oxygen, their bodies were consuming themselves. Carrying an extra 10 to 15 pounds of tent weight up to 28,280 feet may have simply been beyond what their deteriorating bodies could manage. They may have intended to move it higher on one of their earlier rotation attempts and just couldn't do it. The second theory is more disturbing. At extreme heights, the human brain malfunctions in specific and documented ways. One of those ways is confusing intention with reality. Sergey may have genuinely believed the tent was at the cache because his oxygen-starved brain had confused the plan, "We will move the tent up," with the memory, "We moved the tent up." At 28,000 feet, that kind of cognitive failure isn't weakness, it's biology. We don't know which of these is true. We may never know. What we do know is this. Francys and Sergey were confidently descending toward a safety net that didn't exist. They reached their cache at approximately 28,280 feet sometime after 7:30 p.m. in complete darkness. They found the oxygen bottle, they found the nearly empty backpack, and they confirmed what Rodgapov had already seen. There was no tent. So they had a choice. Try to descend another 3,000 vertical feet to where the tent actually was in complete darkness, or wait for sunrise and have a fighting chance. Descending 3,000 feet in those conditions was suicide. They knew it. So they stayed and spent the night in the open at 28,280 feet with no shelter, just the oxygen bottle from the cache and the clothes on their backs. Think about standing 10 to 12 hours sitting exposed at nearly 28,300 feet in temperatures that would kill most people in a fraction of that time. Your body shuts down in stages. Your heart rate slows, your breathing becomes shallow. Your brain, starved of oxygen and warmth, starts to malfunction. Your body wasn't designed to survive that, but somehow, against all odds, both Francys and Sergey made it alive until morning. When the sun came up on May 23rd, they tried to descend, and this is where things get really complicated. At some point during that morning, Francys and Sergey separated. We don't know why. What we know is at 9:35 a.m. on May 23rd, 5 climbers from an Uzbekistan expedition team attempting a summit bid encountered Sergey descending at 27,700 feet. His first words were, "Where is my wife? Did she not come down?" They told him no, they hadn't seen her. And without another word, Sergey continued descending toward Camp 6 at 26,900 feet. He didn't yet know where she was. He didn't know if she was alive or dead. He just knew she wasn't below him. An hour later, at 10:40 a.m., the Uzbekistan expedition reached the first step at approximately 27,900 feet. And there, they found something strange. They saw a woman leaning against a rock alone. Her jacket was open, and she wasn't wearing a climbing harness, which at 27,900 feet was absurd. It was Francys Arsentiev, and as they got closer, they saw something they would never forget. Francys's eyes were open, but they weren't focusing on anything. Her pupils were simply dilated, huge black circles that didn't respond to light. That's a sign of severe brain injury. Her fingers were frozen solid after spending the night exposed at 28,280 feet. The tissue in her hands had crystallized. Her feet were the same. The Uzbek expedition report describes them as out of order. That's a polite way of saying they were destroyed. She couldn't walk. She couldn't stand. She couldn't even bear weight on them. When the climbers tried to place an oxygen mask on her face, she couldn't keep it on her. Her frozen, clumsy hands fumbled at it and tore it off. This is what high-altitude cerebral edema looks like in its advanced stages after 30 hours of exposure at nearly 28,000 feet. Her brain was swelling inside her skull from oxygen deprivation. The swelling was destroying her motor control, her ability to coordinate her hands, her legs, her movements. But it hadn't destroyed her consciousness yet. She was aware. She could see people. She could hear voices. She just couldn't make her body do what she needed it to do. She was, in every meaningful sense, already dead. Her body just hadn't realized it yet. The Uzbek climbers radioed down to base camp and consulted with expedition doctors. They gave her medication. They gave her supplemental oxygen at 4 liters per minute. They massaged her legs and hands, trying desperately to restore circulation to her frozen extremities. Nothing. She showed no signs of improving. They had to make a decision. Remember, they were on a summit attempt themselves. They'd been climbing since before dawn, and they had maybe a few hours of usable energy left to reach the top and get back down safely. So they split their team. 3 climbers continued toward the summit, while 2 stayed with Francys. Over the next several hours, those 2 climbers tried everything they could think of, but one by one, they eventually had to make the same impossible calculation. They had their own survival to consider. Their own oxygen was running low. Their own bodies were breaking down. So they secured Francys to the fixed ropes on the mountain. They made sure oxygen was flowing into her mask, and then they left her and departed for the summit. At 6:20 p.m., as the sun was setting, 2 of the Uzbek climbers on the way down after summiting made one final attempt to save her. Using ropes, they tried to lower Francys down the mountain. They managed to move her approximately 260 feet down. It looked like slowly but surely they would bring her to safety. But then, Francys began having convulsions. The brain swelling from high-altitude cerebral edema had reached a critical point. The climbers couldn't move her anymore. If they tried to lower her while she was convulsing, she'd slip from the ropes. She'd fall. And even if they could somehow get her down, the physical stress of dragging a seizing person down a mountain would likely kill her faster than leaving her still. So they secured Francys to the rope one last time. They made sure her oxygen was still flowing, and then they descended into the gathering darkness, leaving her below that small rock at approximately 27,640 feet. What else could they do? And now, Francys was truly alone at 27,640 feet. secured to a rope on the side of Mount Everest as the sun disappeared and the temperature dropped and darkness settled over the mountain. She had now been above 27,000 feet for nearly 6 days at this point. When the first 3 Uzbek climbers reached Camp 6 at 6 p.m., they found Sergey and told him what they'd found. Your wife is alive. She's at 27,900 feet. She can't move. Sergey didn't hesitate. He immediately began preparing to climb back up to save his wife. The Uzbek team tried to help. They gave him a bottle of oxygen, tea, and medicine, anything that might give him and her a chance. As he went up, he encountered Oleg Grigoriev, another Uzbek climber, on the way down to Camp 6 at around 8:40 p.m. Sergey asked him, "Is Fran here?" Grigoriev answered, "She is still alive." And Sergey continued climbing upward into the darkness towards her. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. Quick note here. Every week on Patreon, I share something new, an exclusive video, or a personal story I don't put on YouTube. If you want to go behind the scenes with me, come join the extreme community on Patreon. See you there. What happened during the night of May 23rd, 1998 is also a mystery. We have no witnesses, just evidence found later that tells a partial story. What we know is that Sergey reached Francys. His ice axe and rope were found approximately 150 to 200 feet away from where Francys lay the next morning, which means he made it. We don't know if she knew when he arrived. We don't know what he said to her or what she said to him. We don't know how long he stayed with her or what he tried to do. What we know is that at some point during that night, Sergey fell, whether he was going down to get more oxygen or trying to reach help, or simply lost his footing in the darkness and exhaustion. We'll never know. And he died somewhere on that mountainside, roughly 740 feet below where Francys lay, leaving Francys alone again. The next morning, May 24th, a second wave of climbers found Francys still alive. She had now been above 27,000 feet for nearly 6 days and exposed to open air above 28,000 feet for approximately 36 hours. Uzbek climber Elias Tukhvatelin reached her first at around 7:50 a.m., followed by the South African expedition team of Ian Woodall, Kathy O'Dowd, and 4 Sherpas. Kathy in particular moved closer and looked at Francys's face, and what she saw stayed with her for the rest of her life. Francys's skin was milky white and totally smooth, like a porcelain doll. Her eyes stared upward, unfocusing, with pupils like huge, dark voids. Her long dark hair spilled across the snow. She looked peaceful, but she was dying in the slowest, cruelest way possible. Ian Woodall and Sherpa Zhangbu attempted to pull Francys upright. If she could bear even partial weight on her feet, the idea was to support her between 2 climbers and help her walk down, or at least move her to a safer position. But as they lifted her, her legs crumpled under her like strands of spaghetti. They were completely destroyed by over 30 hours of exposure. And that's when Francys started speaking. "Don't leave me. I am an American. I am an American. Why are you doing this to me?" Then she cycled back to the beginning. "Don't leave me. I am an American. Why are you doing this to me?" Over and over, unprompted, unresponsive to their questions or their voices. She wasn't answering them. She wasn't reacting to what they were saying. She was just repeating the same 3 phrases in rotation, like a stuck record. O'Dowd realized with horror that Francys wasn't actually communicating. She wasn't responding. She was producing fragments of language. This was the dying words of a dying brain. Like a machine stuck in a loop, her mind was cycling through the only words it could still access. O'Dowd and Woodall spent nearly an hour with her. They gave Francys tea, trying to get warm liquid into her. They checked her legs again, massaging them, looking for any sign of function, any sign that she could move. They did everything they could. It wasn't enough. She was too far gone, and they had to look after themselves. So they left. They straightened up, turned away, and descended. Francys was alone again, watching people walk away from her for the third time in 24 hours. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. The temperature stayed brutally cold, and Francys remained secured to that rope, her body slowly shutting down while her consciousness persisted. At some point later that morning, Sherpas reached her. They found her, still alive, still speaking those same phrases. "Don't leave me. I am an American. Why are you doing this to me?" At approximately 10:55 a.m. on May 24th, 1998, Francys Arsentiev died. She had been out in the open for approximately 48 hours at this point. She had watched people arrive, try to help, and leave, and she had died knowing, at whatever level of awareness was left to her, that no one was coming back. She was 40 years old. Looking back, it's clear what killed Francys and Sergey. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't incompetence or recklessness. Sergey had done it before. He had the experience. He had the skill. And Francys trusted him completely. But what worked for Sergey alone in 1990 didn't account for the variables they faced in 1998. Francys had never climbed a 28,000-foot mountain before. The experience gap was massive. By the time they reached their third summit attempt on May 22nd, they had already spent too long in the death zone. The late summit forced an unplanned descent. The unplanned descent caused separation, and separation caused death. Francys was already dead, and she knew it. But this next climber had no idea what was about to happen to her. At what point does ambition turn deadly? To answer that, you need to see this story.